the best fairy tales and the best stories make us look at a flower a different way, right?
Yeah.
We look at the moon a different way. We look at all these things because we've seen them infused with magic and wonder in these stories. And now we realize, you know what? The real world is just as wonderful as that and just as worth defending. And all of it just becomes more important to us. And our love and loyalty to those small things grows deeper, especially with a story like The Lord of the Rings.
Forgotten books, tales of the brave, call young and old, now read and sing. Imaginations from the light, let not their souls wither.
All right, welcome everybody to episode 2 of the Bitlings podcast. Chad, what's the Bitlings?
The Bitlings are the inklings for a digital age.
The Inklings for a digital age. If you don't know what the Inklings are, go ask ChatGPT. But what we're trying to do here is we're trying to set a context for believers in Jesus to talk about the things that they love in stories and the things that the places in stories that they keep going back to. And that's the thing that we've realized is we go back to these stories and maybe we just go back to parts of the stories. Maybe we go back to scenes or characters and we just read them over and over again, or listen to them over and over again, or watch them over and over again because we love them and they become a part of what shapes us. So,
That's
Chad,
right.
what are we going to talk about today?
Well, I thought we'd start by giving a little bit more of the background on Sargent Family Productions, who are the creators of this podcast. Kenny Sargent, of course, is, for those of you who may not know yet, is the founder and CEO of Sargent Family Productions. In our last episode, he gave us a bit on the history of that. Kenny, you said you felt that your calling to go into this area was a real calling from God, and you felt even a supernatural element to that in some ways. Can you tell us what that's about?
Yeah, absolutely. So I shared with you last time that I never self-identified as a writer. So it had never come into my mind to write a novel or write a screenplay or anything like that. And in 2011, so I was 40 years old at the time. In 2011, my sons took a film class from a supplemental homeschool academy up in Littleton. And it was put on by a friend of mine named Tom, who is a media missionary for Pioneers. And we did a 17-minute film in that where they did it for a class. My two older sons did it for a class. They're now 28 and 29 or something like that. So this is a good while ago. And did a 17-minute film about a young man who finds himself he wants to be in the shoes of his older brother. It's called Boots. He wants to be in the boots of his older brother. And so we did this story and it ended up being fun, and they're being chased. They think they're being chased by this creepy guy, and it ends up being the older brother. And then at the very end of the story, even the older brother gets scared because there actually is a creepy guy with boots that's been chasing him. So it was kind of fun, but huge amount of work. And that summer, I said to my son, Joey, who was the second son, who was the one that directed it, I said, hey, let's do a sequel to that. Let's do a treasure hunt. And then I said, what hasn't been done on a treasure hunt? And I was like, what if there was a treasure hunt in the past that got lost? And somebody in the present found themselves on a treasure hunt in the present that crossed over to the one in the past and found themselves on two different treasure hunts from different generations at the same time. And that was the seed idea. It was like, oh, that's pretty interesting. Well, what I didn't know at the time, Chad, was how an idea like that can take on a life of its own. You're a storyteller. You know what I'm talking about. It's something you begin to muse on. Well, to answer your question, though, I began to pray and ask God for insight. I began to ask him for wisdom. I began to seek to understand this story a little better. And so spring turned to summer turned to fall of 2011. And then going into 2012, to cut to the chase on it, I was in a prayer time on Sunday morning, February 12th, 2012. And I've been about 6 months now of ruminating and thinking about this story and trying to make it more. And remember, at this time, we were thinking it was just going to be a a little sequel to a 17-minute film is all it was at that time. So I was in a prayer time on a Sunday morning, and I asked the question of the Lord. I had been introduced to the concept of the green light guy, the Hollywood guys that and gals that are authorized to make the crucial go, no go decision on whether a film gets made. They're called greenlit people. Greenlit guys typically is what they're called. And so I said to the Lord in prayer, which was kind of funny. I've never done this before. I said, Lord, you're the ultimate green light guy. I said, when you open a door, no one can shut it. And when you shut a door, no one can open it. And I said, are you going to green light this? So I went to church that morning. It was kind of funny. I was chuckling in prayer about it. And I went to church that morning, and I sat down in the pews. And when I sat down in one of the pews, I just opened up one of the little red NIV Bibles that were in front of me in one of the pews. And when I opened it up, that piece of paper was in it. And it said Acts 13:47. And I said, I don't even know what that is. What is Acts 13:47? Well, I put a picture of it underneath. It says, this is what the Lord has commanded us. I've made you a light for the Gentiles, that you may bring salvation to the ends of the earth. So I took it to my elders. One of the deacons said to me, you would be a fool to ignore that. So I began to take it a lot more seriously and really ask the question, okay, what am I supposed to do with this? A friend of mine who is a longtime film and TV director, his name is Jess Stainbrook. He produced the movie called 7 Days in Utopia. He worked with the Downies on the Bible Project, bunch of different things. I told that story to Jess, and he's this kind of straight shooting Philly boy, Chad. And he goes, and I said, I was asking him, I was like, I want to see if I can get 20,000 and make a little 30-minute film. And he goes, oh, forget all that. He goes, forget all that. He said, find out what the story is and then see about how to fund it. And so it really hit me when he did that. So I took a step back from that pressure to try to make a 30-minute film. And what I learned in that process is I'm the kind of guy that likes a rich, complicated story. And so that began the process. That began what I would call the 10,000-hour journey of learning the heart and craft of story. So now 13 years later, this is where we find ourselves. So 2 novels later, almost done with our 3rd full cast dramatized audiobook. Maybe at the end of this one, we can play one of the trailers from that so people can get a sense of what it is. But that was the seed idea. And then that was the day where that calling became real to me.
Yeah.
And one final thing I will say about that, Chad, before we move into what we're going to talk about today, is one of the things that I didn't know at the time was when God gives you those kinds of confirmations, supernatural confirmations, it's not because it's cool. He gives it to you because you're going to need it. So you don't quit under pressure.
Right.
And that's been my observation over the last 13 years, is how challenging this journey can be at times, even though it's filled with joy.
Right.
Also can be extremely challenging. So that's just a little bit for where we are at this point.
Yeah, and if I could just quickly add to that, it's your story seems to me an application of 2 scriptures. Unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain that build it. You're going through the process of figuring out, should I go ahead with this thing? And likewise, Jesus says to count the cost, to consider the cost before building a tower. I think that's what you're doing right there. And so you were able to find confirmation of that. And yet you didn't have all the answers. You went forward saying, I don't know how this is going to go. Will I be able to do this? God doesn't give us a film that tells us everything in the future. We still have to go forth in faith. And so, but you had enough. You had enough to say, let's go. And here we are 13 years later.
Yeah, and there's been many times where it's been just enough. In fact, the way the Lord gave me that scripture, I have made you a light for the Gentiles. First of all, there's an us factor to it. It said, this is what the Lord has commanded us. And so God's brought a bunch of amazing people along the way, yourself included. And people have resonated with the call. And part of what we want to do with the Bitlings podcast is open this up to others for what they love about story and build a community around believers in Jesus that love story and love good story. But that said, there was still very much that sense of, if you think about Abraham, he was always, God said, go to the land I will show you. That was the call. And it was not a given that he was going to know the way every step of the way. And so that's been my experience with it too, is lots of times it's been just enough from the Lord 13 years later. And we're still asking that question. What do we do next? Right. Here we are doing a podcast. Is the Lord going to be in this? Is this something that he's going to build? We'll see. And I think honestly, in fact, let's do this, Chad. Why don't we start with a prayer, and we'll get right into then what we want to talk about in this episode. Heavenly Father, once again, we acknowledge, Lord, that our dependence is on you. Father, we ask you, it feels a little bit weird actually to pray for a podcast, because I feel like in some ways I'm praying and in other ways I'm kind of speaking to the podcast. And so I just ask you for grace to make it a real prayer, Lord, that you would help us to do what you want. If this is your thing, that you would blow on it, help us to build a community around those that love Jesus, those that love story, those that would identify with the Inklings, those kinds of things. So we ask you, Lord, to be in this time. We ask for your blessing. Make us a blessing to those that are listening. Help us to find and really build a community around the people that you want. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. So, Chad, we last time on the show, we talked about a couple of scenes from The Lord of the Rings. And just to remind everybody, one of the goals of the Bitlings podcast is to really focus on areas of story that we really liked and why we liked them. And one of the main purposes of this is for our listeners to either read or listen, or go back and read or listen, to be introduced to a number of stories they've never been introduced to, because we all find ourselves in a glut of stories. We find ourselves with just a saturation of the human race with way too much story. So which ones are worth our time and why? And part of the criteria that we're using on this is what we really liked. And there are many that we would want to hear what they really liked, especially those that are like-hearted on this, that believe in good stories and stories that are well told and stories that leave a mark on the heart that is beautiful. So with that in mind, we talked about a couple of the scenes from The Lord of the Rings last time, and in the spirit of honoring the Inklings with Tolkien, and in the spirit of the fact that Lord of the Rings is the extended editions are actually going to come out in the theaters in June. We're talking specifically about the books this time, but sometimes we would do movies. So why don't you tee up for us what it is that you kind of want to talk about there?
Right. And as a matter of fact, talking about the movies, some of what I want to talk about are things that were left out entirely from the movies. So be warned, listeners, if you're a movie-only person, we're going to talk a little bit about some parts that you may not be familiar with, but we think are worthwhile, very worthwhile. And I'm not even necessarily questioning the choices of the filmmakers. The film's a different medium. You have to do things. But let me set this up by talking about the fact that I read The Lord of the Rings for the first time, I believe it was 1983. Or possibly early 84. I was 12. At that point, I'd already read The Hobbit 9 times. I loved it. It was far and away my favorite book of my childhood. The passing of Thorin Oakenshield was like my first experience with grief as a child.
Wow.
And so, yeah. And I'm glad it was that instead of something else.
You know that, right? That says a lot about you right there.
It does. I loved that book. And I was ready to read The Lord of the Rings. I was 12. And but it took me 2 or 3 tries before I could get through it, and it's because I got bogged down a little bit in the chapters in the Old Forest and with Tom Bombadil and the Barrow Downs, and of course those are scenes that were left out of the movie entirely, except an allusion here and there, or a line given to some other character or something. But I say that because, once I finally got through it, I loved it. It's one of my favorite books of all time. And the interesting change that has happened over the years is that those early chapters that were difficult for me for whatever reason when I was a kid are some of my favorites now.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to talk about them because they really hit me in a unique way. So we're talking about the very beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring, the first volume of the
Okay.
Lord of the Rings, and really the almost the whole of what could be called Book One, because some of you may not know, but the three volumes, the Fellowship of the Ring, the Two Towers, Return of the King, are divided up into 6 books, two per volume. And book one of the first volume goes from the time of Bilbo's birthday party to the arrival of the four hobbits and Strider in Rivendell. So really, all of that stuff. Now, what's different about that? And this is the true of the Hobbit as well. And it's true of many stories that you start small, and the sort of epicness grows as you get more into the story. And those of you who know this story know that it gets epic indeed. It involves really the whole of Middle Earth. There's even stuff happening in the north um, that is not really chronicled in the Lord of the Rings itself. There's battles going in other places in Mirkwood and Erebor and so forth. So, um, but we start off small, and I've grown to appreciate the smaller things over the years. Partly, I think, being a father, having my own little shire here. We think of our our house as like a little shire, or our little bit of land here in the area around us. We're surrounded by woods and farmland, and it's just a great place. Um, and having children, and that brings you back to to things that are very near, very local, very small. We've watched, if you've watched the Marvel movies, you've seen how the stakes are always almost always as high as they can possibly be. It's
For
always
sure.
the
For
world or
sure.
the universe itself that's at
For
stake.
sure.
I that's fine. It's got its place, but I have a great love for the stories that are smaller. It's something I've grown to appreciate as I've gotten older. I don't think I always felt that way.
So, question then, are you saying, Chad, just so I understand it, these are areas that for whatever reason you actually didn't appreciate when you were younger yet? They were either harder to get through or whatever, and now you do. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
why would you say that is?
I think it's because as a young person, as a young boy and a young man, I was always eager for action, right? I always wanted. I won't say that I was consumed with spectacle, and just wanted the car crashes and the gunfights and all that. I love those things, but I did like to get to something um, faster paced.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there's action in these early chapters, but it's more subtle, and there's a lot of mystery surrounding it. And so but I also love mystery stories, detective stories, and some of this feels like a bit like a mystery unfolding.
Agreed.
They don't
Yeah.
know what's going on. They don't know who these writers are, and so there's a lot they don't know, and the battles, the dangers, things they're there, but they're smaller in scale. And having, as I said before, being a father and having my own little household here to deal with, I appreciate that a threat to my own family is more important to me than a threat to the world, or the US or something like that. Those, not that those are not important, but so much of what we're told we need to be scared about in the media will really never have any effect on us.
Mm. So,
But
Chad, let me ask you this: did you actually pick that up fairly early? That question of their responsibility to the Shire or whatever. I mean, because even as I'm hearing that, I'm like, wow, I'm not sure I even think that way. But you're right. I mean, it's clearly that's true as I think about the book itself. But did you actually have a sense of that even then, or only was that much later when you were a father?
I think it was much later. There may have been some hints of it, and things that I thought about, especially when they get back and you see what's been going on. You realize there was more of a threat there than anybody quite thought, or at least that the hobbits thought. Um, but I think it's that. I think it's there's a kind of a tale, a kind of story called a household tale. Chesterton talked about this, where everything is just in the classical unity, not to get off into this sort of side stuff, but in the classical drama there was the unities, the dramatic unities, and Aristotle said that a play should concern one central question of drama, one location, and one day. It should all focus on one day. Now most stories, novels can't do that, but I always liked the stories that did. I always like stories that, and I wrote a book once, a novel that maintained those unities. 99% of it took place in 24 hours, 12 hours really. And so it focuses things more narrowly.
Maybe that's why we like scenes so much.
Right. I think so, because they're
Because scenes
small
are more,
stories
you
in
know, like
themselves.
Robert McKee says, scenes are more or less in one time and space. They have that unity
That's right.
typically.
Exactly. And so I began to appreciate those kind of stories. George MacDonald's The Princess and the Goblin is an example of that, where it's not one day, but it's everything. All the dangers happen in this one house. There's goblins
Mm.
beneath the house and are burrowing up and trying to get into the house. So I love that. And there's a part of me that loves the early chapters of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe a lot, because it's still in that house. They're still working it
Mm.
through. There's that mystery element, and then they get through the wardrobe and it just opens
So
up in a
what is
huge
it
way.
about that, Chad? Help us understand what it is that you really like about that. What, if you were to try to analyze your feelings on that, what is that?
That is a very good question. I think it's that as I've gotten married, as I've had now 7 children, and those some of those are growing up. I have a daughter getting married in less than a month, my oldest daughter, and but the having of children and the building of a household has helped me realize the importance of the small things. I have a great love for the small things, for
Mm.
households and for families, for the relationships that matter to us the most, and a great concern for anything that would threaten that. As I said, we get all uptight about things that are happening on the other side of the world. Those are things perhaps worth knowing about, definitely worth praying about. But if we let them take our focus away from the difference we can make where we are,
Mm.
then I think that's not good. And so the stories, or even the parts of stories that have that smallness. I still love the epic stuff. I still love the great
For
battles
sure.
and the threats to the entire West and all of that. I love the stories of those things, but I love the smallness of them. There's a part where Pippin and Merry are talking later in the Lord of the Rings, and I think Pippin says, "We Tooks and Brandybucks can't live forever on the heights," and
Yeah.
Merry says, "That's true, but at least we can now see them and appreciate those epic things."
Oh,
He
yeah.
said, "We are fitted to love best what we know first, and the roots of the Shire run deep, but there are things deeper still, and I'm glad I know about them." So there's a place for both. But I think because I underappreciated the small things in my younger years, perhaps my appreciation now has become a bit outsized too.
So let
But
me ask you this,
yeah,
Chad. Do you feel, as one of the things again that our listeners we want to put forth before them, of course, is how we felt about things.
right,
One of the things that I hear you say on that is just how, at least I'm reminded of how in certain stories I feel a sense of homeness
hmm,
that I somehow enter into. There's certain stories, or to your point, there's just certain parts of stories. Because Lord of the Rings, you feel very not at home, a lot of it.
right,
But in some cases, you really actually do feel at home. Like when Tolkien says the Hobbit hole, that's not gross. I can't remember exactly how he puts it, but that means comfort. That's
yeah,
what that means,
right.
right? And so, was it some of that, or what do you think it was as you began to appreciate it?
I think it is. And yet I wouldn't be happy with a story that was just little pastoral scenes and just glimpses of farm life or whatever. There has to be dangers. There has to be a threat. There has to be something for the protagonist to react to. And you do have that from very early on in The Lord of the Rings. It's not like he just takes 100 pages just to set the scene and tell you everything about the Hobbit's history. The threat manifests itself very early on. In the first chapter, you realize something's happening with the ring and with Bilbo. And in the second chapter, you get some backstory. And then in chapter 3, they're right out into the adventure, and already Sauron's emissaries are in their own land and extremely close to them. They actually hear one of them speaking to Sam's father, the gaffer, as they're setting out. And so all the way they're dogged by this thing. They don't know how bad it is. They don't understand how great the danger really is. But there's always the threat there. The threat to home, the threat to the small things is
Gotcha.
there. And so they go in, they go out, but what I love is they face these dangers. The riders are on their trail. And I think it's a bit of a foreshadowing, right? The riders can't find them that easily. They're small, they're hobbits, are able to move completely
Oh,
silently
I'd
in the
never thought of that.
woods.
Yeah.
And it's a foreshadowing of later Sam and Frodo creeping unobserved into Mordor. It's that same hobbitness that makes the conclusion of the quest even possible in the end. And so we've got this, we've got the threat, but we've also got the people of the Shire and of the Old Forest, even of Bree, which I still see as an extension of this. There's plenty of hobbits that live in Bree. This is still close. This is still very local in a way. And so you meet Farmer Maggot, right? Of course you have the Gaffer and the guys back in Hobbiton. You have Farmer Maggot's family. You see that little wonderful glimpse of that the life of that family. Um, you have Fatty Bolger back in Crick Hollow, and we return to him a few chapters later when the Black Riders attack Frodo's house in Crick Hollow and what Fatty has to do in response to that. So there's a glimpse back even then. You have Barlam and Butterbur in Bree, and above all, you have Tom Bombadil, who I know he almost never appears in an adaptation, but he's one of the strangest and most mysterious characters in Tolkien. And sometimes people ask me if you could be anybody in the Lord of the Rings, who would it be? Sometimes I've said Bombadil
Really?
because
Why is
that
that?
guy has it all. He's
Well,
immortal. He's got his beautiful wife there, and he's this wonderful little. He's like an atom, but like an unfallen atom almost.
yeah.
And he's got the beauty of the surroundings. He's the lord over his domain. It's small in its way. He's never going to be the king of Gondor and Arnor or anything like that. But he's got his own little domain, and he gives us a glimpse of
Mm,
something greater and higher. The ring has no effect on him. That
right.
is startling. And all of this is in the Hobbit's back door. So one thing I love about it is the reminder that this is a Chestertonian thing, by the way. We are surrounded by wonders. We are surrounded by magic. The very thing we need to live, water, literally falls out of the sky on our heads. We live in a world where a little creepy crawly thing turns into a beautiful monarch butterfly. That's not just a story told to kids. That's real. Human love turns into children, as Indy Wilson said, and you can make a bus fly in the air if you know how to curve a wing and harness explosions. We are surrounded by magic, and the best stories help us to see that. And these early chapters of the Lord of the Rings, for me, remind me of that magic. Bombadil's in our backyard.
Yeah.
There's stuff all around us, and we just need to be able to
Oh,
see it.
yeah. That is so good, Chad. I mean, if I had to put one word into what I love about Lord of the Rings, it's wonder. I think it
Mm,
is that word. But I'd never thought about some of the context you're talking about, but it's totally that.
yeah.
It's yeah, I mean, we'll probably have some others later on, but like one that I can think of is when Gimli asks for one of the strands of hair from Galadriel.
Mm,
That scene is filled with wonder, and that's what
yes.
makes it so delightful. In fact, one thing I hope to get a chance that we could show later on this podcast. My wife is great, not just good, but great at reading Winnie the Pooh.
Mm,
And the reason she's great at reading Winnie the Pooh is because she reads it with wonder.
mm,
It is the most delightful thing to listen to. You can ask any of my kids. They're like, we've thought about, now that it's in the public domain, we've thought about actually trying to put it on a recording, but she just, and it's hard to even articulate why it is, but it's exactly that. So give us a little bit more, I guess, on how that plays out for how you think of those first chapters of Lord of the Rings.
right.
Double click into that and give us a little more detail on that.
Yeah. So one example that comes to mind immediately is we have Sam. Sam's great ambition, if this is the right word in life, is to see the elves, to meet the elves. So we're thinking, if you've never read it before, you think, oh, well, he get him to Rivendell, right? That's where Bilbo first encountered the elves. But what does Tolkien do? No, they're less than, I think, less than a day away from Hobbiton, and they meet Gildor and Glorian and his company of elves in the woods of the Shire. Again, it's just the wonder is in your backyard. You just have to have the eyes to see
Yeah.
it. So
Oh,
that
that's
it's
so
there,
good.
there's so much. And when you get to Bombadil, of course, you see the beauty of the home that Goldberry's made. You see Tom's confidence and his ability to deal with threats. And yet in such a merry way. He's not like going around chopping heads off or things like that. He is singing against his enemies.
Mhm.
It's a the scriptures talks about rejoicing over us with singing and that kind of thing. So there's a and that comes into the Princess and the Goblin. Singing is something that drives the goblins away. Um,
Interesting.
so
And
there's that
it's
wonder in the
interesting.
backyard, and it's there to see.
The wonder in the backyard. I love that. Interesting. So tell us more about why you like Bombadil. Because I feel like it took me a while to warm up to Bombadil.
Yeah, it
And
did me too.
I think it's mainly because it does slow the story down, right? And it's almost, and I've thought before how you couldn't make Lord of the Rings today in the same way. You actually couldn't. It was part of the reason it's so amazing the way it is because it was made, what, 70, 80 years ago or whatever it was. You could not get away with that in a culture where TikTok is doing videos in very short form, right?
Right.
But
Yeah.
um, but I have come to appreciate it, and I typically appreciate it more when I'm taking the whole story again, as opposed to I wouldn't gravitate to that just to read those chapters for me personally. Now, let me
Mhm.
ask you: would you actually go and just read Bombadil?
I would. Yeah.
Really?
There-
Okay, tell us about that.
there's different reasons. One is that he's so intriguing. He's not the ring has no power over him. All right.
Right.
That is intriguing in itself. But then when you get to the Council of Elrond and they talk about Bombadil, they said, well, maybe we just let him keep the ring in there. And Gandalf's like, no, he just set it down and forget it and lose it. It has that little importance to him. That's just weird and intriguing, and it makes me want to know more about a guy like that. Um,
Yeah,
but
because there's a childlikeness to that, isn't there? It's
there
almost
is.
there, but it's a childlikeness that's rooted in he's very adult. You don't get a sense that he's a child. He's very much an adult that can handle adult
Oh
problems.
yeah.
But I do find you wouldn't bring him to the council. He's just not going to help with the peril of Middle Earth.
Yeah.
And so how have you kind of reconciled that? Because I've always kind of thought, I don't want to say I've kind of thought it, but it's almost a little bit irresponsible with the power that he has, I guess.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? But because the way you put it is the way they say it in the book, isn't it? Where say rather that the ring has no hold over him. It's
Right.
not like he has power over the ring. It's
Right.
more, so how do you see that whole thing, I guess?
Yeah. I think he's an example, and he's perfectly placed where he is because again, he's not about the great battles against the Dark Lord. He's very local. He's the wonder in the backyard, and the old forest is right on the border of the Shire, and he just wants to focus on his local little domain, right? And I think that that's important for us because that's what we're called to do. We first and foremost have to take care of our families. We have to take care of the little fiefdom that we have, our little Garden of Eden that we have. And yes, we do. Men are called to go outside of that and fight battles and to take on the powers that be. But we start with our children and our wives, and I think that's what we see in Bombadil. It's also just amazing to me. Now, it will not always be true later in the story, but the thought that there is someone that powerful and that willing and able to come to the Hobbit's rescue, even so early on.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how much of this was in Tolkien's mind because um, I think Tom Bombadil, if I remember right, was the name of one of the kids' stuffed animals, or not
Okay.
stuffed animals, but like a stuffed character or whatever. Um, and he said explicitly when it came to the old forest and Bombadil, he said, I needed a wayside adventure here. I needed something before they got to Bree and met Strider and all that. Although, of course, in the very beginning, he didn't even know who Strider was, he says, when he showed
Yeah.
up in the corner there. But he needed an adventure. It almost seems like an afterthought, but I think it was perfectly placed. And he brings it in. And there's been a lot of debate about who Bombadil is. Some people say, is he God? Is he literally Iluvatar manifest in the flesh? Other people thinks he's maybe Tolkien himself in disguise. Tolkien said he's in a sense the spirit of the English countryside, right?
Hmm.
So there's a homeness to him. He fits in that well. I agree that uh, in terms of structuring the story, it's a bit of a dampening of the pace. There's no doubt about that. And I think that was why I probably struggled with it when I was a kid to try
Hmm.
to get through some of that.
That's probably why it's never been put in the real adaptations or anything,
Right.
because the adaptations have to move faster, of course.
Yep.
And it's been my observation as a storyteller, I'm sure you've seen this too. Sometimes some pretty interesting things come just out of the need to solve a story problem, such
Yeah.
as I need an adventure here or whatever. I don't know how many of our listeners are storytellers themselves, but I'm sure many of them that are would be able to resonate with the necessity becoming the mother of invention. When you have a story problem that you need to solve, sometimes some neat things can come out of that.
Yep.
And sometimes some things you don't even expect. My guess, if Tolkien's anything like a lot of the storytellers I know or whatever, they know their world, but they don't know it. There's a lot of serendipity that happens that brings forth a really nice story. That it's not like they've sat and figured everything out like God. They've discovered something cool, put it on the page.
Right.
You know what I mean? And that's some of
Exactly.
see, and some of those questions go unanswered. Some of the things like, well, who exactly is Bombadil? Well, at the end
Yeah.
of the day, he's a character in a story.
I remember Tolkien saying that no word of Lothlorien had reached my ears until the company stood on at the edge of the Golden Wood. So again, that's another thing that
That's
came up.
super. Yeah.
And yet you think of Galadriel's importance, even eventually to the legends of the elder days. It's amazing that he had not thought of that place before he got there. Same thing with Strider. He said, I had no more notion than the hobbits who Strider was when he appeared sitting in that corner smoking a pipe.
Yeah. In
So
fact, let's
yeah.
double click on that for just a second, Chad. That's one that I have felt like, how part of our goal in this podcast, of course, is to share stories. Well, one of the stories about Lord of the Rings that's so interesting to me is the story about how Lord of the Rings came about. And Strider is a really interesting one to me in that he came late,
Mhm.
as I understand it. And you probably know this better than I do, but in reading, I can't remember what it was, Return to the Shadow or something like that. One of the ones that his son wrote. Strider was a pretty late edition, if I remember.
Mhm.
And if you just think about that from the perspective of how pervasive he is in the entire story,
Right.
I just find that fascinating that he I mean, he's so pervasive, he's so threaded through the entire story. I mean, the third book is literally named after him,
Yeah.
right? The third volume is named not after him per se, but it's about him,
Yeah.
and yet he came late. Do you find that fascinating at all, just in the creative process itself?
Yeah, I do. And in my own writing, I've had that happen to me. Um, you can outline a story to death before you start writing it, and there's some value in that, a lot of value, in fact, in knowing where you're going. But you have to be willing as a storyteller to let the story guide you in places you hadn't planned in advance. And people have said, literary critics will sometimes criticize the Lord of the Rings for this or that. It doesn't really follow all the structural elements we would expect. Um, Part of that is because he listened, and he himself said that at times he felt as if he were just almost recording this, that it was being given to him in a certain way. Now that's not entirely true. He made a lot of changes to it and edits over time.
Yeah.
One reason it took 13 years to write.
Yeah.
But yeah, I love that element of surprise in storytelling, surprise to the author. Some of the
Oh, totally.
this is the thing too. I think whether you're a musician, songwriter, composer, painter, sculptor, poet, novelist, you start out with a new project. Even if you have the germ of an idea, you're probably, if you're like me anyway, you're just almost shaking. You're thinking, there's no way I'll be able to do this. There's no way I'll be able to come up with anything worthwhile. That self-doubt creeps in. But you cannot plan for the moments of genius that your work of art is going to require. It will always surprise you. And the greatness of the art is to stick to your knitting. Keep in it. Just do it. Keep writing. And then things will come out and you'll say, oh my goodness, someone else must have written that. That's too good to come from me. And it's just one of those moments that you could never have predicted. It was never in your outline. It was never in your vision for the story. I don't know what to make of those. Ideas are mysterious. People say, where do you get your ideas from? Well, no one knows. I mean, where ideas come from in a sense, but also ideas are commonplace. They're just everywhere, but a writer takes them and writes them down.
That's
and
right.
so we have to look for those and be willing to accept it. And I think that's really applicable to our lives too. We plan our day out. We say, I've got to do these things today. And then by the end of the day, you look back and be like, boy, I went some places I wasn't expecting there, because life is a story.
Absolutely. That's so good, Chad. I think that might even be a good one for us to end this one on. That I think that we could stand to do some more discussion on that alone later on, I think, because I am finding that to be very true. So many things, so many thoughts come to mind as you're saying that. So any final thoughts for this episode on just again, give us some one last takeaway on why you liked those early chapters and what it is about them. Anything you want to share kind of to finish that up?
Right. Yeah, I think the ultimate thing we need to say here as we go away from it is that the threat to the small things, as we talked about earlier, is real. You see it stirring in those early chapters, but of course, it comes to fulfillment later, while the hobbits are gone. After Saruman is deposed and banished from Orthanc and Isengard, he goes to create mischief. He ends up going, this is a big spoiler alert, of course, but he goes to the Shire, becomes Sharky, and he becomes the tyrant of the Shire. And the hobbits come back to that. They come back to just so many things that they had loved, torn down, broken, defaced. They find their world, their culture, the life they had known has been affected by the menace that they went off to fight. And so we have to be diligent, especially if we are called away as it were, on a quest. If we're fighting out there, we should always have an eye towards what's happening back home. Sam gets a glimpse of it in the Mirror of Galadriel. He sees at least the potentiality for the Shire in flames.
And
I
think he does a good job of that, don't you?
Yes. That part was really good. And that, of course, was their hat tip to the scouring of the Shire, which is what I'm talking about when the hobbits come back and have to drive out the enemies. Sometimes, though, you have to go on the quest to be ready for that. We talked about this, I think, off camera earlier, but when they return and Gandalf warns the hobbits, you may not find all is as well as you hope it to be. And they're like, well, you're coming with us, right? We'll have you with us. He said, no, I'm not going with you. He said, you are grown up, among the great you are, and I no longer have any fear for any of you. In other words, he's saying, you're ready now to defend your homes, to defend the small things, to defend the wonder in your backyard, and to restore it and to rebuild it after the evil that's been done there. And so I think if the best fairy tales and the best stories make us look at a flower a different way, right? We look at the moon a different way. We look at all these things because we've seen them infused with magic and wonder in these stories. And now we realize, you know what? The real world is just as wonderful as that and just as worth defending. And all of it just becomes more important to us. And our love and loyalty to those small things grows deeper, especially with a story like The Lord of the Rings.
Oh, that's so good. That's so good, Chad. Well, wow. Let's wrap it up on that. I think that's a great ending point for this episode. Tell us what you think, everybody, in the comments. Give us a like and subscribe. And what we would like to begin to hear from you all on is, what are the things that you like? What are the things that what are the areas of these stories? There's so much out there about stuff people don't like. We want to know what you do like. That's what we want to see. So if you could drop that in the comments or something, or drop us a line, that would be great. And with that, Chad, how do we wrap this up?
Well, let's have a word of prayer and we'll depart. Lord, thank you again. You are the master storyteller, the master artist, and we are beyond privileged to be even a small part of it. I ask that you would help us and our listeners as we go through our days and make the choices that you would have us to make, guided always by the light of your counsel, your wisdom, your word. Help us to do right, to be the heroes we need to be, even in the small ways that we need to be, even in our own backyards. Thank you again for your many blessings and all your kindness to us. In the name of Christ, we pray. Amen.
Amen. All right, gang. God bless you all. We'll see you next time on the Bitlings podcast.
It's hard to find stories you can trust, especially if you're an older teen or adult who's looking for something with a bit more of a serious grit. Stories that tell the truth about the darker, sharper edges of life, but without sliming you in moral filth. That's the kind of story we create here at Sargent Family Productions. If you're looking for a gripping, heart-pounding tale for your older teen or young adult, or for yourself, put our trust to the test. Get immersed in our Generations saga, available in paperback or fully dramatized audiobook with a full cast, sound effects, and original Hollywood-style music. Try the audiobook of Generations today, and you'll be ready when the dramatic audio of Generations 2, The DC Gambit, drops later this summer. Just go to sargentfamilyproductions.org/shop to get these and other books and audio we've created to give you and your family stories you can trust.
I had the same concern about talking about those chapters that I think Peter Jackson had about, we need to get Bombadil out of there. We're not going to do the Scouring of the Shire, because people do get bogged down in it. I even did that once upon a time myself. But I think we were able to hit on the reasons why they're important, why Tolkien didn't take Bombadil out of the story, and he even said that the Scouring of the Shire is very important to the plot and was foreseen from the beginning. So, I think a lot of
I
people
actually
were,
like the Scouring of the Shire a lot, by the way.
yeah,
I actually really do. It's kind of a secondary climax to me, and I really like it.
right. And I think more people were disappointed about that exclusion than even about Bombadil or the Old
Agreed.
Forest or whatever.
Agreed.
Because, and when you see the hobbits rally to the Horn of Rohan, in Mary's hand, and them fighting the ruffians, it's just a great moment. It's tragic, and Frodo's broken heart over it. It's hard, especially when you think about what else he's getting ready to go through. And he never really gets to fully enjoy
No.
the outcome of the Scouring of the Shire. But yeah,
What's
it's really
interesting
important.
to me though, Chad, on that, my son Nate and I were talking about how, the thing that makes it okay for Frodo at the end is the same thing that makes Gladiator okay, which is there's an eternality to it that makes it legit, I think, where it's
Right.
like, okay. And that's the thing that I think, that's the thing that Gladiator puts forth, is that's why this is okay.
Right.
And that backdrop, the backdrop of eternity, I think, is so essential for any kind of happiness in the mixing of emotions and stuff that comes from some of these great stories.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that, we all have the people we would most want to end up like at the conclusion of the Lord of the Rings. And I think probably the calling of men is to say, I want to end up like Sam, but I'm willing, if need be, to end up like Frodo. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Sam gets it all, the glory and the family, the big family, wife and kids. He has a happy life, and then at the end, the Grey Havens, his is the most perfect ending of anybody's.
For sure. Never thought of it that way. It's true.
But Frodo probably would have liked to have an ending like that too, even if he was maybe more of a confirmed old bachelor than Sam ever could have been.
Right.
But even Frodo doesn't get the Bilbo happy ending, he's too deeply wounded.
Yeah, and I think the movie again does a really nice job on that one, where how does he put it in that how do you pick up the threads of an old life? That part, there's some wounds just go too deep. I can't remember how he puts it, but the gist of it is it's exactly what you're talking about here, where it's like this, and he actually says it to the others. We set out to save the Shire and we saved him, but not for me.
Yeah.
So it's really a beautiful. I mean, yeah, it's so good. I mean, it's just so good. They are so well, Sammy especially. I mean, he was such a world builder. We'd travel to Kansas City from here, which is like an 8 or 9 hour drive, and he and Zach Webb would start world building right as we got in the car, and they would do it all the way to Kansas City. I mean, it was that kind of
men after my own heart there.
Like, for example, Generations 2 clearly has what I would consider a similar overall arc to the Lord of the Rings, which is you have a major climax at a certain place, and then you have a secondary climax later on. That's by design. And so Mount Doom is clearly the climax of Lord of the Rings,
right.
but then you have really an extended epilogue with still quite a bit of conflict, a lot of stuff that they're wrapping up, and a secondary climax with the scouring of the Shire. I just think it's brilliant, and not everybody likes that, by the way. Some people do not, and I don't care.
It's more realistic in a way, because in real life, defeating one enemy doesn't mean that it's you're in paradise now. There's still lots of mopping up operation to be done.
Well, and from a story perspective, you've invested so much in it that I really like the chance to kind of enjoy the ride afterwards. In fact, one of my editors suggested that I not put the last chapter in Generations 2, and I actually disagreed. I was like, no, these people have taken the journey with us. They want to see how this thing wraps up. They want to see, and it's an epilogue really at the end of the day, and I really like it for that. You know what I mean? Some people love their stories to just chop off, but I don't. I feel like I've invested so much, and it's like, oh man, really?
With a long work, that should just be par for the course. It should be expected. If they want something like that what they really want is a short story, probably, or a novella. And detective stories, Chesterton argued, he wrote a bunch of them. He was the creator of the Father Brown series of stories.
Right.
He said that you really, your best detective story ends with a simple explanation. You don't want something super complicated that takes a chapter and a half to unfold. You want some simple fact that but that the audience can be made to forget until the end, and then that's the solution. And then it ends pretty much at that point. He said, the best one would be ones that could end almost immediately after that, because in a short story, you don't have the same kind of development of character and world building and stuff. So it's that, I think people, that's what they want. If they're wanting Lord of the Rings to end on the slopes of Mount Doom or whatever,
which I think is horrible.
That would be wrong for that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. There's too much that's been set up. And I get why they would want that. I mean, it really is the climax, but at the end of the day, I don't know. And not everybody has to agree with us on that. Of course, I get that, but I find it to be more satisfying. In fact, let me share an experience. This is interesting. So we watched a series called Mystery 101. Okay. And it was on Hallmark Channel, and it's actually pretty delightful for Hallmark mysteries. Okay. We really liked it actually quite a bit. It was what I would consider the best of their mysteries. And the weirdest thing happened on this, Chad. So we watch 7 or so of these mysteries, okay, and like one of them was really good. It was like, ooh, I didn't see that coming. That was really good. It was one of those where it was great, and I was like, oh, that's terrific. We might even want to do a show, an episode on it sometime, just to talk about that one, because it was like, wow, this one was, I didn't see that coming, and that was cool. Yeah. If a mystery gets you, and you go, oh, that nicely done. That's a good one. But so the whole thing, basically, I don't want to spoil this one because people might want to watch it, but the last episode ends on this cliffhanger. Okay. And I mean, serious cliffhanger, like 1 minute more than where it could have ended, throws it into a massive cliffhanger with the expectation that there's going to be at least one more show produced after that. Well, Hallmark killed it at that point. And there's reasons for that. I'm guessing it's probably because the main lady went to the other competitive channel, but there's some of this, but they basically killed it. So here's what happened. Here's the interesting part to me. So the writer of the shows comes on, and he does this 15-minute YouTube video where he shares with a YouTuber the concept that he had pitched to Hallmark for the final episode. And the weirdest thing about it was, Chad, I found that to be so helpful. And it was like, all of a sudden, now I haven't even seen it. All I've heard is the pitch. And it had enough detail to tell the whole story, basically, at the big rock level. This is what was going to happen in that hour.
Yep.
But it was like, oh, totally. That totally works. That's a great ending. And now that I've heard that, I feel so much better about the whole series than I would have. And I've been trying to figure out what it is about that, because it's got a closure to it now. It's got an ending that's satisfying, even though I didn't even see it. All I heard was the pitch.
Right.
And I feel so much better about it than I did a week ago.
Exactly. You have to, the story needs to come to a conclusion. And when it's not, it's just the worst.
That one was so funny just because I felt, oh, that's fine now that I know how it ended.
Right. Yeah.
Even without seeing it. It's the weirdest thing, Chad. I think we should talk about that on the show sometime, because it's like, what is it about that worked, even though I've literally seen 10 minutes of a 13-minute YouTube video, and now I'm happy about it.
I can sleep at night now.
Totally. It's exactly what it is.
And it's a tale as old as time. There's been a lot of shows like that built up something cool and then they get canceled or whatever. I think maybe the most famous example of this is Charles Dickens wrote a mystery story called The Mystery of Edwin Drood, but he died before he finished it.
Oh.
And it's been the subject of endless speculation and reconstructions. There was even a book written where the world's great detectives are called in to try to solve the mystery of Edwin Drood. And it was like Sherlock Holmes and Father Brown and Lord Peter Wimsey and Hercule Poirot, all the great literary detectives. They get in there and they solve it, so that's because, and somebody had to do that because it's so unsatisfying to read a great setup and never know how it ends. There's something in us that craves the final act,
Yes. In fact, we watched a series called Troll Hunters. I don't know if you've ever heard of it on Netflix, but
I don't think so.
It was a delightful series for a lot of reasons. Characters are fun. And they did this whole thing. And the basic gist of it is the troll hunter is one that gets called by Merlin at the beginning via this thing called an amulet. And so you have, this is Guillermo del Toro. So it's that at that level, DreamWorks did it. Okay. So it's not small.
Right.
And Troll Hunters went for 52 episodes. And then they had 2 other series after that. And then they had a final movie. And at the final movie, there's various reasons why they did this, but they go back to the very beginning and they have the sidekick best friend find the amulet again. And it's a horrible ending. Nobody likes it. It just feels completely unsatisfying because now all of a sudden you've gone through all this work and you haven't gotten anywhere.
Right.
It's like
status quo ante.
What's the guy that rolls the boulder up the hill only to have it roll back down?
Oh yeah, yeah.
In Greek mythology, you know what I'm talking about?
Exactly.
And so it's a similar thing, even though they did it on purpose. It was like, oh, and people just don't like it, Chad. They don't. It's just such an unsatisfactory ending.
You don't want to reset to the status quo ante. You want there to have been change and growth. It's painful sometimes, but you want to see your characters having learned something, having become different people whilst remaining, with the continuity to who they were before. But
Really?
They've learned something, and then, but too many times they do that. I think there's the old writer saying, kill your darlings, right? And I think there are writers that just don't like to do that. I think J.K. Rowling loved the big 3 too much. Harry, Ron, and Hermione. I don't know if you read the series, but I think she loved them too much. And she just really in the later books, especially, she just protected them, and nothing really changes, and they don't
Yeah.
really grow as characters, in my opinion.
No, and I think what you're talking about there is the reason that I think Infinity War and Endgame work for one reason, and that's because they kill off two of the main characters. That's when I think about that, that's the reason that they work. Is because there's only so many times you can save the universe without being kind of ho-hum, actually. And it sounds like that's what you're saying kind of happened with Harry Potter a little bit.
Yeah, I think so. And there's only so many times you can be told that the heroes are in great peril of their lives, but that you realize there's no stakes here. There's no possibility they're going to get killed. Right.
It's the stakes issue. Exactly. What did my son was in a film class, and it was always goal, urgency, stakes. It's those three things. And if the stakes aren't there, the conflict isn't legit.
Right. That's exactly right.
Now, one thing that I do think is going to be interesting for us to figure out, Chad, is, and it might be simpler than I'm thinking, but like both of us, you especially, but both of us know Lord of the Rings reasonably well. You know it quite well. I know it well, certainly well enough to hang in this conversation for sure.
I think you did. I didn't see any gaps in your knowledge. You seem to know it really well to me.
Yeah, I mean, you've got it at some of the detail level. It's like, oh, that was Crick Hollow. That's right. It's that kind of stuff where it's like, okay, I don't remember all of that, but
I'll tell you why I do. I've read it a number of times, but I grew up on the radio dramas, the BBC radio dramas, and while they do things like cutting out Bombadil, they're extremely faithful to the book. There's none of this Aragorn being dragged off a cliff by a warg who looks like a big mutant puppy or something. It doesn't look like a wolf at all, by the way, but there's none of that. It's extremely faithful. It's so well done. You should look it up. BBC came out in 1981.
Oh, interesting.
And I don't know if it's available on like YouTube or something, but they do have it on Audible. And not in episodic form the way I heard it growing up, but what they've done is just made in three big ones, Fellowship, Towers, and King.
Even as you're saying this, I'm like, I want to listen to that. Oh,
you should. It's so good. There's some times where I think the casting might not have been spot on, but the actors are all uniformly really good, and that's why I know. That's why I can quote lots of parts of the Lord of the Rings, because I heard it so many times. I listened to it as an adult even, and I was just listening to some of it last week, just kind of in getting my mind in gear for this. But yeah, it's worthwhile. It was our Star Wars to us as kids, man. I thought it was good. I thought it was something I would listen to, which is encouraging,
Yeah, totally. That's going to be important. And that's actually a lot of the criteria I use for writing too, which is, do I really like it or not?
Because you don't want your tagline to be like, we didn't like it, but maybe you will.
That's not going to work.
Right.